Welcome to the Heart of Healthcare podcast. I'm Halle Tecco.
I'm Michael Esquivel.
And I'm Steve Krause. And every Monday, we bring you the latest in healthcare innovation as we sit down with entrepreneurs and industry experts.
So buckle up and join us as we figure out how to improve healthcare for all. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the show. I'm Halle Tecco. I'm here with my co-host, Michael Esquivel. Hi, Michael.
Good morning, California time.
Yes, good morning. We are actually, for those who are just listening in, Michael and I are in the same place, and this is the first time we've done an episode in person.
I am stoked that we can finally see each other. It's hard to read body language over a over video. Yeah. So it's nice. It's nice to be together.
It is. And today we have a special episode. We're actually doing a listener Q&A. So we asked you guys to submit questions on social media. We have about 10 that we have selected, and mostly from founders. And Michael is going to give some non-official legal advice, and I'm going to give some somewhat official founder advice.
I love it. Let's jump in.
Yep. All right. So first question we got was, what are investors looking for right now? I have an early idea and not sure when the right time to raise is.
It's such a good question, and it's a really interesting moment. I think we should pick up on what Emily Melton said in our 2025 recap. What I'm seeing, Halle, curious what you as now an investor and as a founder, we're seeing the chasm between have and have-nots expand. It's now become, unfortunately, a bit of the Grand Canyon. And the haves are shrinking. So it is a really, really tough funding environment out there. Deals are still getting done. But when I look across the health tech landscape, it feels to me that tech-enabled services has run into some serious headwinds, but AI-enabled, AI-native solutions in healthcare seem to be picking up some momentum. So I think the overall numbers are probably, as Rock Health noted, moving in a positive direction, but I think it's skewed in favor of these AI-native, AI-enabled health solutions.
Yeah, we're seeing fewer, bigger deals. So fewer companies are raising these mega rounds, and they're mostly AI, as you said. I think the answer to this question is, what are investors looking for? They're looking for AI. I mean, that's really what it is. They're looking for tech-first solutions. I think that if you have an early idea, it's challenging if you are a new founder, right? You've worked with many founders who are on their second, third, fourth companies. Totally. It is, if you've had a successful exit, you can go on, go out and raise a round.
Infinitely easier.
Yes. I mean, you could just have like one pager that talks about what your vision is. And because you've shown that you can execute and scale and exit a company, it's that much easier. Now, if you're someone who's new to the scene that might not necessarily have that founder experience, it's going to be a little bit harder. So.
I agree, Halle. I see that often, with first-time founders. Sort of the feedback I'm seeing across that cohort from VCs is would love to see a little more traction, right? To see a little better metrics, and so it does raise the bar for those founders. And the serial ones are, to your point, able to raise much easier.
The good news is it's never been easier to start a company. We have tools that make it, you can do so much more. You can vibe code an MVP. It's just easier than ever. So you can actually maybe get a little bit of traction sooner than you were able to 5-10 years ago. So, okay. Next question, similar to this on the fundraising is, what is your take on small fund investors versus the mega-VCs?
Yeah, that's always an interesting question. And if you're one of the fortunate founders to have an embarrassment of riches where you've got multiple term sheets or multiple indications of interest, it's a really important question to dive into. Obviously, the mega funds, they're moving earlier downstream into the life cycle, I think, to place bets and to have then opportunities to look at Series A's and B's and C's down the line. And then the smaller funds, we've seen such a massive growth in the number of first-time and second-time funds, Halle, that there's a lot of capital there that's looking to get deployed into exciting companies. The question for you, Halle, is as a founder, when you're thinking about it, putting aside the who can grow with me and support the company over time, like what are the trade-offs? Because I would imagine the small funds can give you a lot more time, a lot more attention.
Yes.
You're an anchor investment in their portfolio. The larger funds, they give you resources, but maybe you're not quite getting the attention of the most senior general partners in those funds. How do you think about it?
I think that's right. I think, well, first of all, I would say the partner that you work with is going to be more important than the fund. And I actually have always been a fan of having digital health cap tables that are a mix of tech and healthcare experts. What I don't like is when there are no healthcare experts on the cap table. I think it's really, really helpful. And actually, there's data that shows that having investors with domain expertise improves outcomes and is more likely to lead to an expert. So first of all, like find investors that understand your space. They're going to get it. They're going to be able to help you in ways that non-domain experts can't. I would say the thing on mega-VCs is it can be great. As you said, they have a ton of resources. They can do follow-on. The downside is if they don't do follow-on, if they did your seed, maybe they did pro rata for your A and then they stop investing, I think it's a really negative signal to all the other investors. I've also seen the mega-VCs, as you said, they have much bigger portfolios. And I've seen where companies not taking off like they had anticipated, and they put like a more junior person on the board, and they kind of just check out. They're like, I have more interesting things going on over here. Now, that's not to say a small fund investor can't do the same. But when I've seen it and I've heard these stories from founders, it tends to be from the mega-VCs that have a much bigger portfolio. And so they're kind of just focusing on certain companies that appear to be doing better, and those that might be struggling or taking longer to get to the next milestone are just less important.
You know, it's interesting. You raise a point that I oftentimes, when founders come to me and they sort of say, you know, how do I reference this particular partner that I'm looking to partner up with on a financing? And oftentimes the instinct is, I'd love to talk to your 3 most high-profile CEOs, right?
Yeah.
But actually, what's really interesting to me is asking, hey, can you introduce me to a CEO or 2 where it didn't work out the way we had planned? And what you see from the great VCs, those that really lean into the relationships and really support their founders, is that's where they spend a lot of their time. They kind of let their winners, they're sort of, you know, humming along, and sometimes the best thing they can do is stay out of the way. But with
kind of like having children.
But with the struggling company, when you see the great venture partners and investors, they'll roll up their sleeves and help try to find a soft landing for the employees, for the business, for the consumers and patients and users. And so it's a really telling sign to get a sense of, share with me a CEO or 2 where it didn't quite work out.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, just look at their portfolio, which companies haven't worked out, and go reach out to those founders and see. I think that's a great idea. All right. This question is one that you are much better positioned to answer than me. Our Series A includes pay to play, and it's freaking me out. I'm worried it punishes smaller insiders and reshapes the cap table. Can you explain what pay to play really does and when it becomes a red flag?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a hard question. There's a lot in there to unpack, and pay to plays can be structured in many, many different ways. But let me just first orient us a little bit here, and I think what is a pay to play? So a pay to play is a mechanic that's put into a financing round that says that if an investor fails to purchase some threshold, whether it's your pro rata or some threshold below that or even above it, if they fail to participate and support the company to that threshold, then there's a penalty. That penalty oftentimes is that all of your existing preferred will convert down to common. And there can even be flavors on that. It can convert 1 to 1. It can convert 1 to, for every 3 shares of preferred, it goes down to 1. So it can really have very dilutive impacts for those investors. And so I think depending on the overall objective of the new round lead and the founders, it can accomplish many different things. But ultimately, the goal really is to try and put every existing investor's feet to the fire, so to speak, and have them step up at a time when presumably the reason you're implementing the pay to play is that companies run into some serious headwinds and troubles.
It's an ultimatum. for the investors.
It can be hard, but to protect your small investors, what I've seen recently done, and this is oftentimes something we do see, is it only applies to major investors or to investors that hold over 1 million shares. Yeah. You look at the cap table because wiping out the smaller investors, while that clearly has a marginal impact. The bigger impact is the large major investors not participating, because remember, when they get converted down to common or sometimes they'll get converted into a junior preferred series, for example, you're reducing the liquidation preference. And therefore, in some ways, for the common, for those that are staying back behind to build the company that haven't left, in other words, it reduces that aggregate liquidation stack. And therefore, it becomes more meaningful at different exit values because you don't have to return as much capital to the investors. So it can be a good thing. The important thing to remember for founders and venture investors is you've got to incentivize the go-forward team. Yeah. In other words, oftentimes I see these pay-to-plays coupled with large option pool increases. And the idea is maybe you put a 20% pool, which is a very large pool, Halle, as you know, and we take half of it, 10%, and give it to the existing team, and then 10% left behind for go-forward hires. Yeah. And so the idea is to really right-size the cap table, bring new equity to those that are going to support the go-forward endeavor and venture, and really incentivize everybody to roll up their sleeves, and whether it's a hard pivot or a small pivot, but really try to take that business and take it out of the tough situation it finds itself in, which required the pay-to-play in the first place.
Well, actually, so talking about incentivizing the current players and who's on the bench today, another listener asked a question. They said, my co-founder and I had an amicable split about 2 years into the company's founding. It's 5 years later, and he still owns a sizable chunk of the company, which feels unfair to exec hires that have stuck around. Is there anything we can do in this situation? I don't want to screw him over, but it's dead equity for the company.
Yeah, this is a tough one, and this can be challenging. First and foremost, I hope that co-founder was on a standard 4-year vest, 1-year cliff. That's a big mistake that sometimes founders make when they either all start fully vested and then somebody decides, this just isn't for me. And he bails on the founders, and he's got all this fully vested equity. And so that can be a real big mistake. And the thesis sometimes is, we'll just all negotiate a vesting schedule at the time of our Series A. But it can be a real miss if something like this happens.
Yeah, they leave before the Series A.
And so then you're stuck. Okay, so let's assume that wasn't the case, and your co-founder left after a couple of years, so she was vested in 50% of her equity, for example. So then it is in some ways dead weight on the cap table. You could view it that way. Obviously, I hope that over that 2-year period, that co-founder did contribute and help the business get further along.
It was amicable leave, so
could have been constructive. So a couple of things I've seen done, especially when it is amicable. You could approach that former co-founder, and ask her to sell back some equity to the company, where they either contribute back equity, which is basically a sale at no price, or they engage in some sort of secondary with the remaining co-founders to rebalance. Yeah. And you try to work a deal because you explain to that departed co-founder, hey, listen, right now we don't have enough equity skin in the game for the go-forward team. Yep. We need to rebalance a little bit. And I'm hoping you'll help bridge that gap by contributing back some of your equity. We're going to increase the pool as well. And so everybody's going to bear a little bit of the pain here, but we really need your help. And if it was amicable and the founder thinks about it, it's the old proverbial phrase, you can have all of a donut or you can have a small piece of a growing pizza pie. And so the hope is when you articulate it and they want to do what's right for the company, they want to see it succeed, they know that, reallocating some of that equity to the go-forward team means that the remaining equity will actually be very much more valuable. And so it could be a real win-win. Sure. But it is a tough one. I see it often. If you don't have an amicable situation, it gets a little tougher. You certainly could do big option pool increases with new equity grants for that team. But that dilution is borne by the existing cap table, and that can be really hard. Yeah, it's unfair. Yeah. So it's a hard one, and every situation's bespoke and unique. And having a good legal consigliere to help you think through it is a fundamental piece of that.
Yeah. All right. We have a couple questions on board governance. How many board seats should founders give up at the seed and Series A if they want to stay in control?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I always start with a broader theme for our founders, which is, listen, if you build a great company, all of this is going to take care of itself. People are sometimes so focused on the downside.
Yeah.
And it's natural, and I'm not suggesting that it isn't. But when you think about all the great companies, going back to Google and Meta and flash forward to today to Databricks and Figma and CoreWeave and all these great, and Sierra and all these great companies, they build great businesses. And so the investors and the stakeholders want to empower the founders to have the ultimate destiny and direction rest in their hands. Yeah. And so really starting from that premise of, look, I'm going to go build a great company. I'm going to execute. Yes, there'll be bumps along the way. Every great company encounters speed bumps. But if I focus on the long term, build a great company, all of these other considerations around, quote, control, end quote, sort of take care of themselves. So I think that's the better way to look at it. And certainly there are other mechanisms you can put in place. Yes, you could have more seats allocated to the common than are designated by the preferred. But even in a balanced board where you have the same number of seats between the investors and the common, for example, which are designated by the founders, bring in a great independent who can provide great guidance to those founders and align with them because they're really working hard. They're building a great business. That too will help empower the kinds of destiny, direction, control that founders are looking for.
Is it right, and this isn't a listener question, this is my kind of question,
Please.
Is it right for founders to feel like protective about giving away board seats?
I think you want to be really – it's a great question, Halle. We shouldn't be – remember, when you give away a board seat, it's a marriage, and there is no divorce kind of concept, really, because as long as the investor holds usually a certain threshold, 25, 50% of their original equity position that they purchased at the Series A or Series B, they will retain the right to continue to designate that seat. So, it can be really, really hard to have a no-fault divorce in startup land.
Sure.
So I do think you don't want to be giving them out regularly. You want to keep the dynamic in the boardroom as tight as you can, especially in the early days, because it allows for, more natural and strategic conversation because you don't have a bunch of voices, or worse, you have a bunch of people in the room and nobody wants to talk, right? And so the discourse doesn't give the founders exactly the strategy, the thoughtfulness. I mean, look, you're an investor. You've been on both sides. When you thought about it, Halle, what was important to you when you were thinking about board composition?
Yeah. So in the early days, seed days, I've always negotiated, and I always encourage founders to negotiate no board until the A. I think just the co-founders can be the board. I mean, so technically you have a board. No outside board members, no investor board members until the A, because in the beginning when it's seed, the reporting requirements, all of that can be really burdensome. And you just want to move as fast as possible at the seed. And then at the A, okay, you've taken more money. The investor is going to insist on a seat. And so that's kind of how I've always acted. So we have a question here, and I've dealt with this. So this is not my question about board observers. So this listener has a board observer who behaves like a director, directing the team and demanding data, which this is that's interesting, right? Like, do they have information rights? Like, what sort of role does an observer have? So do observers have real power, and how do we set boundaries without blowing up the relationship? So observers tend to be minor investors in the company that want to send, generally from my experience, an associate or a principal to the board meeting.
They're not always.
Not always. And they're there and they care, but they're not legally board members.
Yeah, so there's a Delaware law answer and then there's a practical answer.
Okay,
so
let's do the practical answer.
Okay, the practical answer, which is going to be more effective, is listen, you bring someone in as an observer in the dynamic, you ought to expect they're going to be, for the most part, fully participating in the conversation. Presumably you wanted them in the room because they bring some value, they have some, to your point earlier, that maybe they have the healthcare expertise that some of the other tech investor board members may not in our ecosystem. And so I think you do want to encourage robust conversation. There is a fine line. You definitely, they're not voting, so they don't actually have a say on whatever strategic matter is in front of the board, but they do have, they will have influence, and it is a voice that you as a founder wanted in your boardroom. You as a founder, much like in the no divorce scenario of board members, you brought them in. And generally, I see that observers participate to a very similar extent as board members. The good observers, though, realize, and I see this quite often, conversation where they sort of take a step back and say, look, I'm just sharing my perspective. I know I'm not a voting board member. I'm sharing my perspective. It feels like in this situation, maybe you've got an observer who's going a little over the top here. And I think this is where the great dynamic, whether it's a one-on-one conversation with that observer saying, look, I'm really excited to be partnering with you here. I love the contributions, but maybe even some of my board members aren't requesting some of this, and so would appreciate just let's work together here. Alternatively, I have seen where other great investor board members will come together and sort of have that conversation with the observer. That being said, I haven't seen that kind of overreach and overstep too often because these observers want to participate. They want to show the value, and they ultimately made an investment and they want to see the business thrive.
Yeah, and they care. So maybe getting to the root of why they're behaving like this could help. I will say one thing that I've seen is putting a deadline on that observer role. So it's either we'll give you this observer seat for 2 years or until the next financing milestone. And that can kind of help just make sure that you don't have 5 years later on, someone that maybe put in a small check in the beginning, just making too many chefs in the kitchen at some point. You have so many people in the room.
It becomes just, as we said earlier, it's too many bodies in the room.
Yep.
I think the great observers and the great funds that send observers totally get that. Like they're there to provide value. Occasionally you do see an observer who, they wrote a $2 million check at the Series A and this company's now raised $500 million and it just may not make sense. And this is where a self-aware, thoughtful board observer fund will say, look, probably makes sense for us to step off. But generally speaking, like in board members, these observer rights are set forth either in the investor rights agreement or in a separate side letter. And if they're meeting whatever threshold of ownership or whatever conditions you've put on it, it's hard unless they voluntarily step off. It's something contractually they're entitled to. So be mindful of that.
And I mean, they get the information rights of the board.
Totally,
so they get that.
Totally,
okay,
and they get all of that.
A few more questions. This one's really tricky. My company seems to have plateaued. We raised a seed, had strong growth for 2 years, then flattened out. We've been pretty flat for the last 12 months. We still have 12 months of runway. Should we invest in testing new ideas or cut burn as low as possible?
Both.
Yes.
It's a hard one, Halle. Curious from your perspective. Look, I'll just share mine. I've been privileged to do this for 25 years and counting, and just more osmosis than this isn't really a legal comment, more just osmosis and doing it. Look, I don't think so. The natural question is, do I cut burn or do I just return the money, the capital back to my investors?
I've had that happen as an angel.
It has happened, right? When founders have lost conviction in the idea and it sounds like in this particular question, the founder hasn't lost conviction. They're just still struggling to find that right PMF or whatever. And so, look, but venture investors as a general matter didn't get into the business of just getting their money back. So I think most of them, if it's a good team, they're thoughtful, they've been great stewards of capital at this point, are going to say, let's go for it. Like, go home or go broke, right? I mean, it's kind of the mentality. And so, I wouldn't continue. Obviously, the current path isn't working. Yeah. So continuing in that path. So if you're going to continue in that direction, then maybe cutting burn and giving yourself more quarters to work it out and digest the new models and approaches you're taking makes sense. But if you're going to do a hard pivot, like, sit down with your investors, say we're gonna totally shift the business, and then see if they're excited about that, and see if you can get a little more capital with this new focus, and go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think an important thing for this founder is to kind of diagnose the problem. And so flattened out, does that mean that there are no more customers interested? You've tapped out the market for this, in which case then the only option, if you're going to stick with this exact product, is to increase the LTV, to increase the amount you're making per customer. But if you've reached all the customers that you can possibly get in a seed, it's probably not a big enough market. So for it to be venture backable. So I think that would be the issue. The good news is, again, there's never been a better time and an easier time to start a company. So cutting costs, cutting burn should be easy. You need to be leveraging all the tools possible to get more out of every person in every seat. And absolutely, I mean, cutting burn is hard, but it's actually really common. And I think that most employees kind of understand. They see the writing on the wall, and they'd rather see a leader who's transparent about here's what's going on. Here's what's happening. This is what we're going to do. And here's the plan to get out of it. Because
I love that, Halle. That is such a critical piece of advice. You know, transparency with your team, with your investors.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we're in this foxhole together. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's work our way out of it. And
pretending like nothing's wrong, pretending like things are still great. Huge mistake. Too many founders do that because they're afraid of any backlash. But let me tell you, it's going to be much worse to face the death spiral that will inevitably happen if you don't address the problem. So
one of the things I've observed, so Halle and I have been on multiple journeys together in her role as a founder. And one of the things I really admire about Halle that maybe a lot of people don't appreciate is she always led with transparency, with thoughtfulness. It was always about, hey, we're all in this boat together. And you'd be amazed at how that, Halle, not that you didn't have great outcomes, but there were bumps like every startup encounters. And when you approached it that way, people were more loyal. They were more like, this is the leader I want to get behind. If she's going to go for broke here and lean all in, I'm going to do the same. And so when you take that approach and build that culture within your organization, you just see tremendous loyalty. And those are the great leaders and more importantly, result in great outcomes.
Well, thank you. And
I've observed it multiple times with you, whether it was at Rock Health and some of the tough days we had there or Natalist or any of the other, businesses we've been collaborating on over these years. It's been quite an impressive and admirable quality that you brought to your
thank
teams.
you. And the problems that I face, the companies I've run are not unusual. Every company faces this. I think, as you said, Facebook had a down round. Like every company has dealt with ups and downs, and it's part of the job to shepherd the team through them and make sure everybody is very crystal clear. If there's ever a better time to get crystal clear on a strategy, it is when you have to pull yourself out of what feels like an impossible situation as a founder. So
no, it reminds me of the old adage, and I can't remember which partner said this, but I know it's been repeated and reverberated across our industry, both health tech, regular tech, and so on, is never let a good crisis go to waste. Yeah. Right? So it is sage advice, and that's a moment to rally everybody and to roll up the sleeves and do the hard things.
Yeah. Exactly. All right. This is a question for you. This is a very specific question. A founder has a health system contract. The buyer insists on uncapped liability and broad indemnities and says, everyone signs this. As a startup, what's reasonable here and what should we absolutely not accept?
It's a terrific question, Halle, and I got to say it comes up all the time in our practice.
Oh, really?
If in talking to my commercial partners that run our technology transactions practice, this is the age-old question. And every negotiation, as you all know, is different. And so what you're really trying to do is balance.
Sorry, can you just explain what uncapped liability and broad indemnities even mean?
Yeah. So oftentimes in these commercial deals, and you're talking to a quasi skilled person in this arena, but we've got plenty of partners and lawyers across the ecosystem who just specialize in this area. Oftentimes in these deals, especially where leverage maybe is in favor of the counterparty and not the startup, they will request in their whatever partnership, collaboration agreement, customer contract that the startup bear any liability that emanates from whatever that partnership arrangement is going to bring. And then they want, broad indemnities, meaning that the company will stand behind any liability that's incurred by that counterparty. And so the question is, how do I navigate that? And the answer is every negotiation is different, but what you really need to do is balance the need to get the deal done versus managing risk appropriately, right? And so, you're constantly in every contract negotiation, especially in healthcare, you're balancing those two. I got to get this deal done. To your point, I got to show more metrics so I can raise that next round. I got to get it done.
I can't lose this marquee customer contract.
So how do I do that with managing risk appropriately? But there's something even more important not asked in this question that I think many forget, which is you need to think about how do we preempt that liability out of the gate? Yeah. And you say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I'd have us review our security practices. Like, think about privacy, get insurance. There are ways to preempt and prevent that from becoming necessarily a reality. And so if you're proactive in that way, you can really manage that risk. Yeah. And look, so every negotiation is going to be bespoke. You know, if you're a 3-person startup and Epic's on the other side, that's a very different set of parameters and leverage dynamics. And so you just got to be mindful of it and really always. Startups at the end of the day, I say this often, are not in the risk elimination business. They're in the risk mitigation business. And so you're balancing the business needs against the risks and trying to find a way to move forward to ultimately help that vision become a reality and turn this into hopefully a truly iconic company.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, Michael, we got through all these questions. Thank you, everyone, for submitting. If we did not get your question, apologize. Maybe next time we will. And if you have other questions for us, you can just send them to our LinkedIn profile, The Heart of Healthcare, and we'd love to hear from you. Michael, thank you.
Thanks, Halle. It was fun.
Hopefully, it was helpful for folks.
I hope so. We'll talk soon.
Awesome.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to The Heart of Healthcare. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please leave a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe. The Heart of Healthcare is produced by Halle Tecco and hosted by Michael Esquivel, Steve Krause, and Halle Tecco. The show is engineered, edited, and mixed by Kyle Moore. Visit our website, heartofhealthcarepodcast.com, for show notes and details.